thanks indeed for joining us on the program. Wherever you're watching from around the world, we are live from our studios here in Lagos, Nigeria. I am Kelly Egiga. We are monitoring developments around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the war now at day 752. But let's begin with reactions to President Vladimir Putin's landslide election victory, as allies such as China were quick to congratulate Mr. Putin, but Western countries have denounced what they called an illegal election. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the election as an illegitimate imitation. It comes as Mr. Putin won a fifth term in the country's presidential polls with 87% of the vote. The voting took place against the backdrop of one of the harshest crackdown on the opposition and freedom of speech in the country. However, Western countries have condemned the polls as a sham, with no credible opposition candidate allowed.
It's been 3 days of voting for Russians in the country's presidential elections, in which Vladimir Putin, the country's president, is guaranteed to win a fifth time after a culmination of 19 years under his belt. It's an election condemned by the White House as obviously not free nor fair. Even Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned the polls, saying the Russian president wants to rule forever and that the presidential election was an illegitimate imitation. But Vladimir Putin is not the only name on the ballot. 3 other names offered voters varying choices. Ultra-nationalist Leonid Slutsky of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, Vladislav Devenkov of the relatively liberal New People's Party, and veteran candidate Nikolai Karentinov of the Communist Party as supporting characters to the political geography. Although there were a few skirmishes as police clashed with protesters, the polls have gone largely peacefully. And by Sunday evening, after polls closed, the first official results showed Vladimir Putin had won 87.97% of the presidential vote. The early results followed an exit poll that showed Putin winning 87.8% of the vote.
In the meantime, Russian citizens in Nigeria flocked to a polling station in Lagos to cast their vote. For them, it's essential that their voices are counted, even though they are miles away from Russia.
Very important, because we're voting for president and I want my voice to be counted. Even though I'm not in Russia, but I'm Russian citizen. It's my right to vote.
It is hugely important. In this really important spirit of my country, every vote counts, and I absolutely invite everyone to cast your vote. Our votes are heard, and every vote counts.
The choice I make, I take, whatever that comes out of it, I take it, because it's my decision. So I feel it's important for me to vote because it gives me the privilege to exercise my right.
All right, so let's unpack all of this and dissect these latest developments and President Putin's landslide election victory. I'm joined by the chairman, Nigerians in Diaspora Organization, Dr. Godwin Ibe, who joins us live from Moscow. Also on the program, a former president, Nigerian community in Volgograd, Dr. Nedu, and therefore who is also a global affairs analyst, joins us live from Volgograd. Gentlemen, we must thank you indeed for agreeing to speak with us here on Channels TV.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Mr. Putin rose to power in 1999. That's about 25 years, and he's now Russia's longest-serving leader in more than 200 years. Let's begin from Moscow, where Dr. Ibe is. I wonder, what does this victory mean for Russians?
Oh, it means a lot. It means a lot because it's coming at the back of 2 major events. The first one is the broad sanctions that were placed on Russians by the West, and the feeling of attempts at regime change from external force, or rather election interference. So it gives them a motive to want to exercise their voting rights. That the turnout rate for this election was over 74%. So they didn't just want to keep quiet or just because they believe President Putin will win. So why bother coming out? But they decided to come out. You can see people even as far as Lagos, Transnistria, coming out to exercise their voting right because they feel the pressure, the undue, unfair pressure from outside for regime change. Secondly, the reasons for which the attempts at regime change were placed were due to the decisions taken by a president which is seen as being in the national interest. For example, fighting for the protection of the lives of Russians, whether in Russia or in the Donbas region. So, and also finding alternate methods or ways out of the sanctions that were placed, and also the economy doing well despite the ineffective 11 rounds of sanctions. So based on these two factors which we can see in this geopolitical climate, obviously the Russians are very, very driven, motivated to come out and vote. And we can see it in the election, the landslide victory, very high record turnout.
All right, Doctor, I was going. Allow me to stay with you for a moment, because yes, indeed, there was a large turnout of voters, not just in Russia, but all around the world. And President Putin won with about 87.87% of the vote. So you believe that this is reflective of the Russian support for Mr. Putin, despite the narrative that Russians do want a change?
Obviously, Russians don't care about the narratives outside of Russia. They came out, they voted, they were international observers, by the way. The election was so smooth and so reflective of the will of people that even Senegal, observers from Senegal, they came and they said they are ready to use Russia's experience and introduce an electronic voting system in the country's presidential election. That's according to Salio Sambo, a representative of the Senegal Human Rights Commission. We have people even out of Russia, in Transnistria, in Lagos. You can see them voting, and they are usually, it's from the, if you get their opinion, you see that most of them also support President Putin. So you have many ways to check if people actually support. If you go to Transnistria, I believe that most people there will also support President Putin. So you have many ways to check, and it's definitely reflective. So whatever they are saying outside of Russia is obviously not important. Instead, it motivates them to come out. That's why you see a very high turnout.
All right, let's bring in Dr. Nedu into the conversation, who is live for us in Volgograd. Doctor, we understand that some opponents staged a symbolic noon protest a few hours ago at some polling stations. Any of such protests in Volgograd where you are?
Well, actually, it's quite the opposite. Here in Volgograd, everywhere is quite peaceful. I've been around the regions where you have the polling stations. Everybody is casting their franchise, exercising their franchise, casting their votes in a very peaceful manner. And if you speak with the average Russian person on the streets here at work and meet them, they are quite optimistic about it, about Putin being the next president. Because if you look at it, there is no reasonable or serious opposition to his presidency. He has actually done quite well for the Russian people. Looking at the economy and the sanctions that were being heaped on Russia and how well it has done over the years, I think it's actually it's positive, if you ask me.
All right. How about you, Dr. Ibe? I mean, you are in Moscow. Any of such protests in Moscow?
I personally didn't see it. But I can imagine that in every society there are fringe elements. But when 87% of the population say we want something, you can only just listen to what the minorities say, but you cannot really change any. In everywhere, the East, in the West, if close to 90% of the population say, this is how we want to live, this is who we want to lead us, this is what we want our policies to be, it really doesn't matter whether some fringe elements say they want this or they want something else. I can't imagine. In fact, the fact that they can express their right without being arrested goes against the narrative which you earlier said that they are suppressed or they are not. The fact that those fringe elements could even still come out and make those means that they are free to speak. And moreover, there are alternatives to not voting. Like you can keep quiet. For example, I may decide not to come for this interview. For example, I may decide to play neutral and to be in the sidelines. But no, I don't. I come out and I tell you the way it is. Maybe people come out, they vote. They say no, we are not shy, we are not timid. We don't care what you think. We do what we believe, and that's it. And you see the result.
All right, so we will talk about the reactions coming from some leaders, world leaders all around the world. But both of you have been have possibly been in Russia long enough to have naturalized. And so I wonder perhaps, let me begin with you, Dr. Ibe. Did you vote in this election?
As the chairman of Nigerians in Diaspora Organization, I don't like the focus to be on me because I represent a lot of people. But what I can tell you is that lots of Nigerians who have naturalized in Russia actually voted. And there was no case. In fact, you could vote electronically. You didn't even need to go to the voting station. You just from your phone, from your mobile phone, you can lay on your bed, just tick, 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 and that is it. You don't even need to open a laptop. You don't need to go anywhere. It was so easy, so smooth. People were so happy that there were no glitches. There were no servers that were down. There were no bimodal cards or PVC or whatever that doesn't work, or people that don't have password to voting machine. Just very, very smooth. And it was organized in a time where at the weekend, when people didn't have to work, a lot of companies, organizations gave time to vote, and they even donated staff to help to monitor, to observe. Especially public organizations, they donated actually their staff to help out in the whole process. So it was super smooth. Not smooth, it was super smooth.
And Dr. Nedu in Volgograd, did you vote?
Well, actually, I didn't vote. I have my reasons not to vote, but I think it's quite, if you look at it from just like Dr. Ibe said, every Russian, they came out to exercise their right to vote. They were quite optimistic about having Putin, who has over 80% approval rating, which has been collaborated by both the Western and the Russian sources, as the rightful man.
I'm wondering why both of you are being really diplomatic with your answers. And let me stay with you, Dr. Nedu, because some of the reactions from the world leaders have condemned these elections. For instance, the EU says it was an election where there was no independence, no freedom, and no choice. Speak to us from that window, Dr. Nedu.
Well, actually, of course, there has to be a propaganda. That's why it's politics. Well, I think last month, Tucker Carlson, he came over to Moscow to interview Vladimir Putin, and also he was allowed to go into the city and to meet people, go into the supermarket, and to understand and to interact with people, to know the reactions and the consciousness of the Russian people. What did he say? He did his independent investigation, not relying on what is being fed in the mainstream media by BBC, by CNN, and by MSNBC. But he came over, He did his independent investigation, interviewed a lot of people, interviewed people on the streets, interviewed people, or he went to the train station to see the real people, the real action, the real reactions of people. When he went back to the US, what did he say? That's the most important thing. You know, it has got an era where independent investigation, you know, this is the era for independent investigation, not relying on propaganda from most Western medias. Actually, right now, it's quite difficult to get an unadulterated news from most. I'm sorry to say this. I know I'm in a very in a platform in a mainstream media platform, but I have to tell you the truth. Most times, most of this media, most of the Western media, they have a side. They have to play a side, and it's quite difficult to get an unadulterated news. Of course, there's going to be some propaganda.
All right, let's get back, Dr. Ibe, into the conversation. Dr. Ibe, despite the condemnation from Western countries, I wonder just why is Mr. Putin enjoying so much popularity?
I gave the reasons earlier. Because the truth always wins in the end, and Russian people can see through the propaganda for the two reasons that, first of all, they did nothing wrong. Broad sanctions are placed on them. Number two, the president is defending their interests. Now, if we move a little bit focused so that we don't give too much value to the propaganda. What about India? Let's talk about what the friends of Russia said. Indian Prime Minister congratulated Putin in the election and expressed hope for further strengthening of partnership between Russia and India. The Emir of UAE also congratulated Putin. Belarusian President Lukashenko personally called Putin and congratulated him on his victory.
And those are all allies. Those are all allies of Russia. I know that even President Xi Jinping of China also congratulated Mr. Putin. So, Dr. Ibe, the question to ask perhaps would be, how do leaders all around the world, for instance, how do they maintain the fine balance of condemnation and diplomatic relations with Mr. Putin and Russia?
They don't need to maintain any balance. Like, nobody cares about what they like flip-flop or somersault. Russia doesn't really care about that. You see, after 11 rounds of ineffective sanctions, Russia was still able to guide its economy to growth. Basically, remember when there was news about Russia taking chips from Russia washing machines, and now Russia outproduces the West in drones. Remember when there was a price ceiling on oil? Now global suppliers do not even obey the price ceiling. Something as simple as that. That's to go to show that NATO does not represent the world. And so there's no their balance is not needed. They can disbalance or somersault if they prefer. But the whole world is doing business with Russia, increasing bilateral trade, improving, buying cheap oil as cheap and as fast as they can get it, buying energy, nuclear energy, and exchanging material. You can see Senegal, they've come and said, oh, we saw your electronic system, we love that, we want that in our country. And many more people are doing that on different sectors of the economy. Meanwhile, those people can continue to disbalance themselves and somersault.
All right. Let me pose this question to both of you, and perhaps we'll begin with Dr. Nedu in Volgograd, because in Mr. Putin's acceptance speech, the Russian president has again sent a warning that any move against Russia would result in direct conflict with that country. So how seriously should the world heed to these latest warning from Mr. Putin?
Well, I would say that every country has the right to protect themselves. Every country has the right for self-protection, self-preservation. If we look at it, if we try to look at it objectively, I think Russia also has the right to protect themselves. If you look at it from the lens of a Russian person, from the Russian perspective, they have the right of self-preservation. So it's quite him being the president of Russia. He has to say that because in order to garner support from the people, because actually, if you look at it, this election is basically centered on the war in Ukraine. So he has to kind of garner support and confidence in the people that he will do everything within his power to protect the lives of the citizens of Russia.
All right. Well, I mean, we're absolutely pressed for time, but I should perhaps squeeze in this final question, because you've mentioned the war in Ukraine. It's been over 2 years now since Russia's invasion of that country. The attack in Belgorod just yesterday is one of the over 60 reported shelling incidents of border territories and settlements. So maybe you can just squeeze in this in 20 seconds or less, which we are learning, of course, damaged some buildings and hospitals and all of that. So I wonder, do you think this war is far from being over?
Well, we never can tell. We have everybody, including the Russian citizens, so we all have fingers crossed. The president of Russia has actually said that he doesn't even want the war. Everyone is tired of the war. Everybody wants the war to be over, but he asked for the right things to be done. He has said that he's ready to see across.
Yeah, so all right. So I mean, because we're absolutely pressed for time, I'd like Dr. Ibe to also respond to that question. Dr. Ibe, please.
The war is over, but the battle continues. Russia won. It's as simple as that. Because the tone of the West has changed. Initially, it was we'll defeat Russia on the battlefield. Then it changed to it's a stalemate. Now Ukraine is out of ammunition. The fact is that it's not sustainable over a long term. Of course, in every war, everyone loses in a war because there are loss of manpower and artillery, and the economy, has to balance. But in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the fact that Ukraine has lost 20% of its territory already, and over close to 500,000 lives lost, for a country that is just 30 million people and 15 million have left the country as migrants, obviously it's a heavy loss for Ukraine, even though it's a loss for both people. It's a heavier loss for you.
It's a fine place to anchor a conversation with you, gentlemen. We must thank you indeed for speaking with us. The chairman, Nigerians in Diaspora Organization, Dr. Godwin Ibe, as well as live for us in Moscow. And then we also had, of course, Dr. Nedu Ndefo, President, Nigerian Community in Volgograd, live for us in Volgograd. Our concern is that both of you, gentlemen, and all the Nigerians in Russia, please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And on a more lighter note, I guess it's safe to call them besties now. I'm talking about U.S. President Joe Biden and former U.S. President Donald Trump. It's all thanks to these two residents of Lovinya in Moscow region as they visited their local polling stations wearing masks of Biden and Trump to vote in the Russian presidential election. And footage shows the pair fake Biden and Trump outside the polling station registering to vote and entering the polling booths. But according to local administrations, both residents had to take off their masks in order to confirm their real identity before they could cast their vote.